M, Chocolate Girls. By George MacBlyer. Contents. Introduction 3. Marco 5. Canda 6. Lola leaves the bar 9. Swinging London 10. Nikki 11. Why do dogs chase cars? 15. Dirty Sweet Girls 16. Miranda 20. Madeleine 22. Morning After 24. Warning: this story contains references to prostitution, sexuality, drugs, and adult themes that some readers may find unsettling. Introduction. John found himself once again seated at the 80 bar in Soi 80, Hua Hin, Thailand in that strange tropical hour when the late afternoon heat begins to loosen its grip and the neon signs prepare for battle with the sunset. His companion Lola was chatting with her sister cousin Oi, the formidable manager of the bar, who sat enthroned behind the counter like a provincial duchess presiding over a minor kingdom of gin, gossip, and heartbreak. Lola meanwhile perched elegantly on a stool with her tiny lapdog Stang asleep in her arms, Stang being Thai slang for money, which amused John greatly, as the creature looked exactly like a tiny tax inspector. John had just begun his first gin and tonic of the day. Whatever one might say about Oi, and many had, usually after midnight, no woman in Hua Hin could produce a gin and tonic with such lethal efficiency and such a radiant smile. The sisters spoke rapidly in Thai. John understood almost nothing, though as a professor of linguistics he possessed the dangerous confidence common to scholars who mistake fragments for understanding. He often interpreted conversations incorrectly, but in ways far more entertaining than reality. Certain words floated toward him like buoys in a fog. Marco. That would be Marco the Belgian, former regular of the 80 bar, philosopher of beer, an amateur motorcyclist, recently killed while attempting to overtake a truck on Fetkasem Road after several enthusiastic whiskies. Then came the word "fying" several times, the Thai term for Western foreigners. John immediately suspected they were discussing the unfortunate Englishman Kevin Raybib, who had reportedly died after being poisoned by a bar girl who was intent on robbing him. Canda. Then Lola mentioned Canda, at which point both sisters dissolved into laughter so violent they nearly slid from their chairs. John smiled nervously into his gin. Canda had once been the brief reigning attraction of the 80 bar, a tiny, impossibly youthful girl from Isan with enormous dark eyes and the unsettling poise of someone who had understood adult economics far too early in life. John had originally refused her invitation to become one of his so-called research participants. She looked about 14 and possessed no identification whatsoever. John had no desire to end up as a middle-aged cautionary tale in a Thai prison, some tragic hybrid of Bridget Jones and Midnight Express. Other expatriates had possessed fewer reservations. According to Lola, one elderly Scandinavian had practically moved into the bar for a month merely to enjoy Canda's companionship, or as Victorian gentlemen once phrased it, the comforts of feminine society. Ironically, one of Canda's more devoted patrons, a Welshman named Dave, had recently died of a heart attack. At least he died smiling, thought John. Though, given the accumulated sins of Soi 80, John suspected poor Dave might spend a brief administrative period in purgatory before proceeding elsewhere. Eventually, however, John himself surrendered to Canda's invitation for what he insisted upon calling a research interview, partly out of academic vanity and partly to soothe his conscience. Afterwards, Canda marched proudly through the bar waving 2,000 baht above her head like Joan of Arc returning from battle. Lola leaves the bar. Lola suddenly remembered an errand in town. She rose gracefully, adjusted her handbag, and the tiny dog leapt from her lap and immediately began barking furiously at passing tuk-tuks, as if defending the entire kingdom of Thailand from motorized invasion. The sight triggered an old memory in John's mind, Swinging London, early 1970s. Swinging London. Back then he worked as a vaguely hippie-ish minicab driver for city cars in Angel, Islington. Officially respectable, the firm was in reality loosely attached to the orbit of the Welbeck Street operation in the West End, an establishment widely believed to possess warm relations with gentlemen of Sicilian temperament. London still vibrated with the aftershocks of the 1960s then: Afghan coats, transistor radios, political marches, hashish smoke, and the fading illusion that freedom and chaos were merely different brands of perfume. Nicky. One driver in particular dominated John's memories of London, Nicky. Nicky existed somewhere between a Carnaby Street dandy and a full-time swinger. He drove a customized Vauxhall Victor painstakingly refashioned to resemble a bargain bin American muscle car, and dressed in what might generously be called late imperial Carnaby Street hippie chic: Afghan sheepskin coat, velvet scarves, handmade Cuban heeled boots, and enough hairspray to preserve the bouffant of an 18th-century French duchess through a hurricane. There was something faintly androgynous about him. He resembled a slightly less glamorous version of Mark Bolan at the height of the glam rock years, all curls, pout, and calculated languor, though with more desperation lurking beneath the polish. He also possessed a chihuahua. The creature functioned less as a pet than as a tactical device in Nicky's endless romantic offensives. Young women would approach to admire the tiny dog, Nicky would deploy the charm. The remainder unfolded with the efficiency of a rehearsed military exercise. It was this very chihuahua that stirred John's memories now, because it reminded him so strongly of Lola's little lap dog, the one he himself had bought for her. John ordered a second gin and tonic. His thoughts drifted further. When he first arrived in Thailand, in respectable middle age, he had still been relatively naive concerning the more exotic branches of human courtship. This innocence was rapidly corrected by Lola, whose philosophy concerning fidelity was flexible in the way tropical bamboo is flexible during monsoon season. If Lola was tired, annoyed, or otherwise occupied, she occasionally delegated John's recreational requirements to one of her numerous friends, cousins, former colleagues, or mysterious female acquaintances who appeared and disappeared like characters in a Graham Greene novel. Still, if one searched for the original architect of John's moral decline, at least from a Victorian perspective, the true culprit was not Lola. It was Nicky. By his third gin and tonic, while motorbikes screamed through Soy 80 and stray dogs barked hysterically at invisible enemies and mindlessly chased tuk-tuks, John found himself contemplating a question that had troubled philosophers for decades. Why do dogs chase cars? And, more importantly, why do men mindlessly chase women? Disaster, intoxication, or what one might euphemistically call amatory adventure, with equal irrational enthusiasm. Men spoke endlessly of reason, civilization, and moral philosophy, yet remove a few social restraints, and most reverted almost immediately to excited apes in cheap aftershave. Miranda and Madeleine, revisited. Dirty sweet girls. Nicky eventually introduced young John to two untamed, dirty sweet upper-class girls from Richmond, London, dark Miranda and blonde Madeleine, with the promise of banging the gong and getting it on. He described them, with solemn medical certainty, as nymphomaniacs, though whether this represented psychiatric diagnosis or wishful thinking remained unclear. According to Nicky, Miranda possessed an almost theological devotion to what Victorian novels called gentlemanly attentions. Her appetite for oral gallantry was allegedly so uncontrollable that she would perform acts of intimate diplomacy in changing rooms, taxicabs, and once, if Nicky was to be believed, behind a curtain at a Chelsea cocktail party while Bridge over Troubled Water played faintly in the background. John suspected exaggeration. But not complete exaggeration. Nicky invited John to his flat in West Central London, cramped, overheated, and smelling faintly of hashish, incense, and aramis, the pungent masculine aftershave fashionable at the time. The girls arrived lured by promises of alcohol, soft drugs, excitement, and the opportunity to meet John the Adonis, as Nicky absurdly described him. Nicky regarded John as a kind of male Justine of Deschardes fame, Attractive, innocent-looking, and fatally gullible, precisely the sort of youth destined to be lured into traps by those more experienced than himself. In this sense, late 1960s London occasionally resembled 18th century Paris, a city where innocence survived mainly as prey. There was whiskey. There was hashish. There was soft lighting and quieter music, not T. Rex's Get It On, but melancholy Baroque chamber music more suited to the evening's increasingly theatrical intimacies. At moments, the atmosphere resembled the soundtrack of the 1969 film Justine, drifting somewhere between libertinism and parody. Somewhere between the Baroque music and Marianne Faithfull singing, As Tears Go By, the evening dissolved into something resembling erotic theatre mixed with voyeurism, intoxication, and performance. Nicky himself seemed to enjoy directing the spectacle almost more than participating in it, like a low-budget Ken Russell film director staging a decadent rehearsal. Miranda still wore her school uniform when she arrived, but without panties, as Nicky had requested. She resembled a young Christine Keeler, long dark hair, narrow frame, and the dangerous self-awareness of someone who understood precisely the effect she produced on men. Britain was still haunted by the ghost of the Profumo affair, and Miranda carried some of that same volatile mixture of innocence, ambition, sexuality, and social menace. Madeleine was entirely different. Blonde, soft-faced, and faintly melancholy, she resembled less Mandy Rice Davies than a young Marianne Faithfull, who had wandered accidentally into the wrong novel. She wore a short black skirt that showed her white panties when she sat or bent down, a white blouse, knee socks, and cultivated an air of exaggerated innocence that would have delighted Nabokov of Lolita fame. Unlike Miranda, however, Madeleine possessed genuine sweetness beneath the performance. The daughter of a prosperous Richmond solicitor, comfortably educated and carefully raised, she seemed both fascinated and quietly disturbed by the libertine world into which Nicky had introduced her. The evening itself mattered less than its atmosphere, bravado, experimentation, theatre, and the peculiar sexual confusion of post-1960s London. Morning after. John had promised to drive the girls home in his enormous ice blue Ford Zephyr Mk4. A car he regarded as magnificently American despite its unmistakably British mechanics. By dawn they found themselves in a workers' cafe near Richmond. At the next table sat slaughterhouse labourers in blood-stained overalls drinking tea, with the weary resignation of men who had encountered too much reality too early in the morning. Miranda, in her unmistakably plummy accent, suddenly announced at theatrical volume. "John, what is this sticky stuff in my hair? What exactly did you do to me last night?" Several workmen nearly choked on their corned beef sandwiches. Madeleine burst into laughter. Miranda smiled triumphantly. John realized then that the entire evening had perhaps been less about pleasure than performance, a form of social provocation staged partly for effect. They enjoyed shocking respectable society, and perhaps shocking themselves. Still, young John was no innocent curate. Years driving London minicabs had already introduced him to enough strange women, gangsters, addicts, and lost souls to populate 3 Dickens novels, 2 de Chardet manuscripts, and several police reports. But enough of swinging London. John was still sitting in the 80 bar in Hua Hin, now working dangerously through his 5th gin and tonic while neon lights flickered outside, and somewhere in Soy 80 another foreigner was probably falling in love with someone half his age and twice his intelligence.